Domestic violence is a national crisis. 1 woman a week and 1 man a month are killed by a current or former partner.
This guy appears and grabs her by the hair. He drags the woman off the porch.
In today's society, we witness a pervasive and often strategic absence of communication surrounding domestic and family violence, where the experiences of victim survivors remain hidden from the public eye and even from public support services and systems. This silence is not merely a lack of speech, but a complex survival mechanism and a systemic failure that leaves many voices unheard. Society often overlooks specific groups whose unique experiences of violence are silenced by societal and structural barriers. These are some of the issues that we are seized with in today's edition of the Kwedu Report. At Kwedu, we don't just report news, we tell the story of a people, where we come from, what we have lived through, and what we are becoming. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just news, it's memory, it's identity, and I would want even to call it perspective. Welcome to the Kwedu Report, brought to you by Yericom Media. My name is Harry and I am your host. Our topic today is domestic silence, a focus on the unheard voices in domestic and family violence. And our guest to help us unpack and dissect this topic is Oliver Maboreke. Oliver, welcome to the Kwedu Report.
Thank you, Harry. It's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Now, Oliver Maboreke, just briefly, he is an international project planning and community development practitioner with extensive local and international experience. He runs an emerging event management and social entrepreneur consultants business at Harvard Global Links. He is also the author of the innovative social entrepreneur and business training methodology called Zinaye Methods. Oliver is also a gospel musician who has released 3 albums to date and is currently authoring a book on successful leadership. And Oliver holds a Master's of Science, International Project Planning and Development, Bachelor of Arts in Media and Development Studies, Bachelor of Arts Education, Bachelor of Business Event Management, Bachelor of Science Counseling. I can go on and on. Oliver has extensive working experience in the local, federal government and state governments here in Australia in community development and project planning. He has also worked in the Victorian Department of Premier, United Nations Development Programme, Mass Public Opinion Institute of Southern Africa, and Padare's Main Forum on Gender, Western Sydney University, and the New South Wales Department of Justice, and currently he is working with the Wesley Mission in the specialized intensive therapeutic care significant disability for vulnerable young people in care. Oliver also sits on various boards, including the African think tank, Lions Club International, Lung Dentity, and he is also currently a New South Wales multicultural ambassador. Now, we can go on and on. A highly experienced gentleman we have here today to discuss this topic of domestic silence and domestic violence. Now, Oliver, you are a migrant. If you look at your migrant experience, in your work, especially with the Settlement Services International, how have you seen cultural and language barriers silence victims within migrant and refugee communities? And what unique risks do these unheard individuals face compared to the broader population in a society like Australia?
Thank you, Harry. Look, domestic violence, it's a very topical issue. It's, I can call it a cancer in society because it has got a wide-ranging impact across various sectors in the community, particularly, on women and children who actually bear the brunt of of domestic violence. But as you said in your introduction, there's this segment of people within our society that I coined, that's why I coined the word domestic silence, that have got a silent voice that sometimes are not heard. And most of these are mainly, as I said, are mainly the male or the men in the society. But as just responding to your question, being a migrant, when you move to a new country, there are different systems. There are many barriers. One of them, like my experience working at SSI, was that one of the barriers, one, cultural barriers. People come from cultures that have various tenets, and then when they move here, Australia is a very, very different society, different rules that govern maybe family setups, that govern maybe relationships, that govern even, the way we're supposed to respond to each other's issues. So you find that when people come here, they're faced with these various challenges, and one of the biggest barriers is also the language. Most clients that I worked with were mainly coming from countries that do not speak English, and Australia is a speaking country. So now trying to navigate that, and then you are trying to navigate, one, the challenge of understanding the language, secondly the challenge of trying to understanding the cultural dimensions, and then thirdly you are trying to settle and get your way around things and trying to survive in terms of having food at the table, and then on many other things, bills and stuff like that. So that brings a lot of challenges, and as a result, the aspect of domestic violence has not been dealt effectively at that level, because when people are not interacted according to their cultural understanding, their linguistic understanding, then you find that sometimes it brings a lack of understanding, and therefore you find that there is a spike in domestic violence in those sectors in Australia.
Still on cultural barriers, Oliver, how do you see cultural expectations, especially of saving face or community honor, prevent victims from seeking help? And how can advocates reach out into these closed spaces? Because we see a lot of victims in most areas because they want to save face and protect their positions in society. Then victims, they end up not seeking help.
So that's a big one, because you see sometimes, as I said, like the cultural dimension is a big issue, and also bring it to a religious dimension as well. You find that particularly around family, particularly our men in society, there's the element of shame. So back where I come from, it's very rare for a man to come out and say, "Oh, look, I'm having, domestic issues in the home," because you sometimes culture would detect that you're weak for coming up and say that. So as a result, you find that most people tend to just bottle things in because they don't want to be perceived as weak, and also they don't want to be perceived as maybe as people that cannot be able to handle their things in their own way, maybe within their cultural or religious confines. And then also they're what I call, community gatekeepers or religious gatekeepers. These are people within the society that sort of like set the tone for the majority of people that they have behind them. So they decide what comes out of the community, what goes in. As a result, even if there are sectors of the community that want to come out and speak about these issues, they didn't detect this narrative. They then decide the narratives of what needs to be spoken about, not what should be spoken about, because they feel that, look, it might tarnish, one, their cultural outlook, two, their religious outlook as well. So that's one of the biggest barriers that is faced.
Now, Oliver, cultural barriers are not the only stumbling block here in addressing the issue of domestic and family violence. We also have the issue of institutional trust. For those people, like, see, Australia is a multicultural society where we have people from all over the world. Now, we may have people who are seeking asylum or with uncertain visa status. They fear deportation, you see, and that can be a powerful tool for abusers. How can we build trust in a system that many victims fear might punish them for reporting violence? Because, you see, some victims, when they look at their visa status, see, then they say, oh, if I report this, then see, that may actually open up other things. See, especially if they have uncertain visa statuses. How can this be addressed?
So yeah, that's a big one. So you find that sometimes there are institutional barriers. Australia, it's a very highly institutionalized country. It's got systems, it's got governing system in place. So you find that people that are coming from probably, I'll give an example. Some of the refugees that come to Australia as refugees or asylum seekers, they're coming from environments where there's war, right? So most of them, when they see anybody who's in uniform, they attribute them to somebody holding a gun and there's a threat. So you find somebody like that will never go out and report an issue to the police because they've got that there's that stigma around maybe a person in uniform or holding a gun. And then secondly, like you rightly said, most people that are asylum seekers and are on certain visas, they are in there, they do not readily go and maybe report because for fear of being deported, like you have said. And I think the best solution around is that for the Australian system to put in place strategies whereby look, anybody who's within the confines of Australia is able to access this service despite of their visa status, and then also be able to articulate that despite somebody's visa status, they need to be able to access these services so that they can be supported around issues of domestic and family violence. Because if you don't, the issue will just perpetuate on and on. Yeah.
Certainly, I think a relook at some of the institutional frameworks will definitely help so that these victims can be more forthcoming. If you are just joining us, welcome to the Kwedu Report. And today, where we are discussing the topic domestic and family violence, a focus on the unheard voices. And in tonight's program, we are joined by Oliver Maboreke, a highly experienced man. You can follow and like our page, Kwedu Classics, on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. You can also get to read all the latest news on the Kwedu news on our website, hericommedia.com. Now, Oliver, let us look at men specifically here. The question of accountability and prevention, engaging men in the conversation. In most cases, men, they shy away from this topic. You have a reputation of helping individuals become the best version of themselves, according to the Vinaya methodology. How do we bring men into the conversation about domestic violence without them feeling defensive, and particularly in culturally diverse communities?
Yeah, as I said, look, working with men is a very big passion of mine, and because look, as myself being a man, I understand some of the challenges that men. Men generally are seen as the breadwinners, are seen as the head of the homes, are seen as the people that provide. So they hold a very, very big responsibility, and I think many people or society don't really appreciate some of the struggles that men go through. And one of the biggest things is that men generally do not speak about their struggles. They always put up a brave face, and they tend to just, and even when you look at things even like around, health and sexual health, men will not go and seek help because they just tend to keep things longer than it should be. So that's a big issue. And even as we're talking about this issue on domestic violence, that's why I coined my current study that I'm doing recently, domestic silence, because you find that men generally do not speak openly about domestic violence, either if they're perpetrators or even if they are victims. More so if they're actually victims, you find that because of the pride, the the ego, that is associated with men. It's very hard for a man to actually come up and say, look, I'm a victim of domestic violence, or I'm going through this. And you must also understand that domestic violence is not just physical; it's actually emotional and psychological. So I think men are big victims of psychological and emotional domestic violence, and it is very, very hard for those issues to come out because men generally do not talk. Men mostly just, men themselves up, they meet maybe at pubs or social circles, and then they talk about the great things that are happening around them. But rarely do you find men actually talking about their struggles and what they're going through. So the key thing is actually meeting men where they are. Sometimes, rather than waiting for men to come up into the open, so it's about waiting for men to come up with that. That's why I was telling you that, look, we have started in our community. We started this program called Padare, which is basically a phrase coined in our traditional circles around where men sit around a fire and talk about their own things. So you find that when men are together and they're kind of casual and they're, having maybe a drink or two, they tend to open up more and talk about their things. So that's where you can actually be able to actually get information or get, these struggles that men are going through. And also men also are very, they do not trust easily. So it is very important that you're able to get people that are actually very trusted within the male circles to actually be able to facilitate these talks with men, or this engagement with men, because generally men will not open up very easily, but when they do open up, it's actually to a person that they really trust a lot. So it's very important that maybe in culture we use our cultural groups, our cultural circles, we use our our cultural leaders, our what I call gatekeepers in the society, whether they can be maybe religious leaders, pastors in the churches, traditional leaders in the community, or people that are respected in the community, to actually engage these men in their circles. Only then will we actually be able to actually bring out some of these issues and be able to address some of the things surrounding the issue of domestic and family violence.
Yeah, quite true. Most men, they say, "Oh, let me just deal with it," but in so doing, their decisions may actually affect the whole family. Because if you are the man of the house, you are, or a family person, there are other people who also depend on you. So, Oliver, in other words, you are actually advocating for redefining masculinity. A question related to that: what role does redefining traditional masculinity play in preventing domestic violence before it starts? Because I think the most effective way of dealing with it is try and go and deal with it before it starts, especially among young people in the Zimbabwean and broader African diaspora.
Yes, it's very important. So, look, I was actually reading through the year report of the Australian Government Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Commission, which they brought out in October 2025. They've got some very beautiful recommendations where they seek to target young men at their infancy. So, I think we need to start having these discussions when kids are growing up, when kids are in kindergarten and in primary school, and we start having this conversation rather than trying to have these conversations when when people are adults and they're almost like trying to firefight something that has already happened. We need to actually look at prevention, rather than the cure. So let's look at prevention first. Preventative methodologies are actually very, very important. Empower the young people when they're at a young age, and let them learn to actually have conversations about things that they are challenged about. It is only when then that you actually can get these young people as they grow up and they become adults to actually be open to discuss things that they're struggling with. Because I think what has been happening is that the society is set up in such a way that it's actually more responsive to crisis rather than actually preventing that crisis before it actually happens. So let's start at the grassroots level, and then also let's make sure that our strategies are culturally appropriate. They are culturally appropriate, not focus on just embracing, making Australia is not one culture. Australia is a multicultural society. So let's make sure that we are very targeted in our approaches at cultures, at religious groups, and go and interrogate them at their level, so that we actually are able to actually get the information, the raw information at that level, rather than actually generalizing and just blanket covering Australia as just one community. It is not one community. It is a rainbow of societies that we need to address.
Yeah, I think that aligns well with the view that children should be viewed as witnesses rather than victims in their own right. Um, see, how often can we better amplify the voices of children who grow up in these environments?
I think, as I said, look, as I said, the first thing would be to actually empower the young children as they're growing up when they're young. Then can they be able to actually be able to, speak about what they're going through. And then also the voices of young people are very, very important. I've worked in the child protection sector for a long time. You find that we need to develop child-friendly strategies to talk to children, to educate children about how to maybe to disclose family and domestic violence situation that they're facing, as well, maybe to their teachers at school, or to their maybe groups where they are hanging around. So it is actually very important, and this can only be done, as I said, when kids are actually educated at a young age, and they're actually empowered, and they know the tools that they can use to actually identify what domestic violence is, what abuse is, and so forth. So it is very important that you actually catch them young and empower them to actually be able to identify some of these signs of domestic and family violence.
Empowering the children while they're still young. I think that would be a very, very effective method. Now, Oliver, uh, we also have here financial and housing silence. These are some of the very important factors that may also affect the victims of domestic and family violence. This is a situation where we see victims having to choose between violence and homelessness. See, when you are in a family and instead of reporting family and domestic violence, some people fear that they may be asked to leave the home and they will be homeless. And in most cases, victims' voices are often lost to the struggle for survival. So there will be a debate whether to speak out or whether to deal with it and survive. What immediate systemic changes are needed to ensure that probably housing is a right, not a luxury for survivors, especially for survivors of domestic and family violence?
Yeah, that's very important. So it's very important that, look, maybe through maybe government departments, that there's actually a deliberate strategy that is put in place. I know at the moment there's actually if there's somebody is facing family violence, there's actually, I think, a payment. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 5,000 that they receive immediately, so that they can actually be able to move to a safer location. But I think, amidst all this, the housing crisis and the cost of living, it is very difficult even for organizations that give support to people that are facing domestic and family violence, because these organizations are not well funded to provide this service as much as they want to fund the services. So it's actually very important that probably through government department, they actually fund a wide range of organizations that can actually be able to support families that are facing domestic violence, and also be able to give proper support in terms of the financial support, to enable people that have actually experienced family and domestic violence, that they can actually be able to stand on their feet and be able to live in this very difficult economic times where people are really stretching on the dollar because of what's happening now. Even if you look at even the cost of mortgages and stuff like that, it's really impacting a lot of people across the board. So it is very important that we have more services available for both women, children, and men that are facing violence, and then also services actually able to be able to even to support particularly men that are either perpetrators or victims. Because I think one of the things that I've generally, society is very supportive of women that are victims of violence or children. There's very robust you know um, structures that are in place. But I think if you are to effectively address the issue of family and domestic violence, we need to be able to have a holistic approach to the issue, and be able to address the issues across the board. So that, because the more we don't address all the issues on board, you find that the vicious cycle of family and domestic violence will keep going, because there are certain sectors that are being neglected.
Yeah, they Oliver advocating for a holistic approach to address the issue of domestic and family violence. especially when we consider the unheard stories or the unheard voices of for domestic and family violence victims. Now, Oliver, you are a motivational speaker and a great storyteller. Do you think survivors of domestic and family violence can use their own narratives to drive policy change without being re-traumatized by the process?
Yes, I do think so. It's actually a very important process whereby people actually are able to actually give, their own experiences and how they've dealt, So, like I was talking to you about this domestic family violence report that was provided in October 2025, there's actually a group that has been set up, which is called the Lived Experience Advisory Council. So it's actually got a chair and a few people that are in there. So it's actually very important that you actually got this group. So these are a group of people that have actually lived experiences. They can actually be able to give true, like and lived experiences of domestic and family violence. And these are the people that can actually be able to drive this, whether it's policy change or strategic direction in terms of how family and community and domestic violence can be handled. So it is very important because I think this group here includes various sectors of people, like people from Aboriginal background, women, young people, and also because having a group like that, it will actually take care of things like diverse communities, because there are many barriers that affect most people that have lived the experience of family violence, and these include, like I said, language, cultural stigma, limited access to actual culturally safe services as well. So it is very important that people that have got a lived experience are actually given a platform to actually be able to speak, because they will actually encourage others that have got that experience to actually be able to be brave and come out and actually be able to, so that the more brave that they are to come out, you find that there will be more strategies that can actually be built upon to actually put together robust policies to help people against this this scourge of family and domestic violence.
Oh, there we are. Oliver Maboreke telling us what he thinks about the role that survivors of domestic and family violence can play in trying to drive policy change without being re-traumatized by the process. Now, Oliver, we want to go to our last question of the day. We've had a long night here. You have been the chairperson of the Zima Zimbabwe Association in Australia in the past 2 years, and also you have worked with the African think tank. What has been the most effective way to start conversations about taboo topics like coercive control in community settings, and also even this very topic that we have been talking about of domestic and family violence?
So one of the most important things is to use influential figures within the society that are respected, and also to actually have core groups. Like at the moment, like I told you, during my tenure as Zimbabwean, the chair of the Zimbabwean community in Australia, what we did was that we actually started creating men's groups in various local government areas across New South Wales, whereby men will meet maybe every month, where they just have a casual discussions around challenges that they're facing or successes and stuff like that. So we find that that's how men will start talking about issues, and then they realize that no, look, even if they're facing certain struggles, they are not alone, but there are many other people that are facing those struggles. So it is very important that like I said, that strategy has really worked quite a lot, because there have been many men groups that actually been that have come up across different LGAs, and also using sectors like the church is very important, because you find that these people that we're talking about in the community, they belong to one church or the other, or maybe a mosque, if you're talking, because some people are from a Muslim background. So you find that it is very important that we address people in their little corners of circle of influences, but then it is actually very strategic that you actually get people that are influential, that are actually able to actually address and dissect these issues, and be able to actually open them up to free and in free spaces where men can actually be able to articulate these things. So, and they need to be, as I said, culturally appropriate. Like I use that term Padare. Like most African communities and even Aboriginal communities, they have the concept of the fire, sitting around the fire and talk about issues. So when you do that, you bring across this cultural concept whereby men can actually be able to freely talk about issues, and then you can start addressing those issues at that grassroots level instead of starting it at a high level.
Starting at the grassroots level, definitely. That should be the way to go. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have for you tonight on the Kwedu Report. We have been discussing the topic domestic silence, a focus on the unheard voices in domestic and family violence. And our guest tonight was Oliver Maboreke. He is the immediate past president of the Zimbabwe Association in Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, you can follow and like our page, Kwedu Classics, on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also read the latest news on our website, hericommedia.com. We do hope you enjoyed tonight's program. We always want to hear your opinions. Hit the chat box and be part of this very, very engaging discussion that we have been having today. We always want to hear what you think. How best do you think this issue can be resolved, can be solved? How best do you think they can be helped, the unheard voices in domestic and family violence? Once again, Oliver, thank you very much for joining us on the Kwedu Report.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, viewers. Till we meet again in another episode of the Kwedu Report. You have a good one.